Last year, on 7th August, we started Kashmiri Youth Movement to put forward the voice of of the youth of the young Kashmiri Hindu youth. And today, on its first anniversary, we have Mr. Sushil Panditji with us. Mr. Sushil Panditji is a world-renowned Kashmiri Hindu activist to put forward the voice of leader and of the youth and intellectual Kashmiri Hindu youth with extreme knowledge on its first anniversary of the history of Kashmir. We have Mr. Sushil Thank you for joining us, sir. Mr. Sushil Panditji is a world-renowned Kashmiri Hindu activist, a prominent Kashmiri leader. Before we proceed, I would like you to give a brief to our audience about the history of Kashmir. Of the history of Kashmir. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Before we proceed, I would like you to give a brief
Could you
to our
repeat what you
audience
said? You
about
would
the
like me
history
to
of
give a
Kashmir.
brief history of Kashmir?
A brief to tell our youth what actually was, and
Is that
since
for
you
me?
have seen the exodus and you've lived in Kashmir, you would be a better you would of
Could you
course give
repeat
them a
what you
better
said?
idea
You would like
of
me
the
to give a
history
brief
of
history of
and
Kashmir?
what it was like to live in Kashmir. Tell our youth actually what actually
Rather
was,
than
and since you have seen the exodus and you've lived in Kashmir, you would be
Okay, I think first
you
of
would
all,
of course
we
give them a
must
better
know
idea of the history of Kashmir and what it was
that
like to live in
Kashmir
Kashmir and what 1990 was actually like, rather than the
has a
propaganda
long
that is spread
history,
all over internet.
has a very, very long history which goes
Okay, I think first
beyond
of all,
the
we must
historiography, the modern history writing that we are aware of. And very little of it is taught in the schools. The irony is, even Kashmiris, our own children, we ourselves, our parents, were never taught about it, and we are, for generations, unaware of this history. And that disconnection from our roots is much responsible for all kinds of lies and propaganda going unchallenged. It is also responsible for a lack of perspective within us, the big picture view to how to assess the challenges that we face, or to even know who we are in the right context. So it is critical that we spend some time to start with on who are we when we say we are Kashmiris and we come from Kashmir. What was Kashmir, and how did our ancestors come to be there? What are the various sources through which we can find out these facts? What are those primary texts that mention these informations for us? And we are completely unaware of those, forget being taught about it, being told about it. We are not even aware, most of us, of our own origins. And that is tragic. So when I talk about Kashmir, what are the sources I'm talking about? Kashmir can be found in one of the earliest texts about its origin, which is called Nilmat Puran. One thing that I came to be aware of this was through our Jantri. Are you aware of the word Jantri?
Yes, sir. Nechpatam Janti.
So this is one small book in blue color, which is in every Kashmiri Hindu household, that is consulted by our parents, elders, when they are looking for the right date and the right time, or when they are looking for the right vidhi to do a puja. All that is in a Jantri. Jantri in Kashmiri is the word for Panchang in Sanskrit.
Yes.
Panchang is called almanac in English. The traditional timekeeping, the calendar. So my first awareness of what is the antiquity of this community and this place was revealed by this almanac, this Jantri, of which we are in the 5096th year. If you go consult your Jantri, you will see it is called Saptarishi Samvat. You must have heard of Vikrami Samvat. You must have heard of Iswi Samvat. You know, Samvat is again a starting point of a calendar. So Iswi Samvat is keeping time from the birth of Christ. Okay? Like we say BC and CE, before Christ and Common Era. Right? So today we are in 2020 CE, Common Era. Or Christian Era, CE. So timekeeping starts from there. But in the Hindu calendars, there is something called Vikrami Samvat. And Vikrami Samvat starts 57 years before that. So right now, we are in 2077 Vikrami Samvat. All right? But 2020 CE, Common Era, or Iswi Samvat. But according to our Panchang, we are in 5096th year of Saptarishi Samvat. And this is the oldest practiced almanac anywhere in the world. Oldest practiced calendar, timekeeping tradition anywhere in the world belongs to Kashmir and Kashmiri Hindus. It is called Saptarishi Samvat, 5096th year. Now, we go far beyond that. It doesn't mean that we are there for the last 5096 years. We are maintaining a calendar for the last 5096 years. We existed thousands of years before that, before we learned to keep time, before we learned to read and write. We've been in Kashmir. When I first realized it, it gave me goosebumps. For two reasons. I was very happy that we go so far back. Our roots are so deep in history, in time. So this was a measure of happiness, though I have not contributed to it. I am only gloating in the glory of just a coincidence that I am born in this community. No credit to me that we are as old as 5096 years of timekeeping. So this is just about a coincidence. But I was happy that I was fortunate to be part of this pristine, antique, old tradition. But I was very, very sad as well. And the sadness was that a tradition which carried on uninterrupted for 5066 years in that land called Kashmir was uprooted from there 30 years ago in my lifetime, during my generation, and today survives somehow outside that land where it belongs. So mine is that unfortunate generation which could not keep it going in that land where it was born. Such a valuable old tradition that my ancestors gave their life and blood to nourish, grow, and create, today no longer exists because these almanacs are not made in Kashmir anymore. Those who did that are out of Kashmir. Some live in Jammu, some live in Delhi NCR, some live somewhere else, spread all over the world. They are somehow carrying on this tradition. But the fact that this tradition got uprooted from Kashmir really makes me very sad. And I hold myself, my own generation, responsible for it. That we did not try hard enough to keep it going there. So when I was sensitized and made aware of this, the logical question was, what else did my ancestors do besides timekeeping? If for thousands of years this is what they did, and so accurately, because timekeeping is no easy task. It involves a great deal of knowledge and skill. It involves tracking the planetary movement. It involves predicting the full moon day and the eclipses and the right date for the right festival, which have been predicted hundreds of years before they occur. So how meticulous timekeeping, how scientific and accurate timekeeping my ancestors did was fascinating. So there must be more fascinating things that they may have done, which I am not aware of. That is what started my journey in the quest of knowing who are we, who our ancestors were, and what did they achieve. And that is what took me to one of the primary sources of our history, which is Nilmat Puran. And when you see, you must have heard of Puranas. In our ancient texts, there are Ved, there are Upanishads, and there are Puranas. Purans are old texts, and I wanted to know how old. So I was told the latest Puran also is at least 1,000 years old. The older Purans go several thousand years back. Nilmat Puran is about 1,600 years old. And when I procured a copy, I got a translation. The translation is done by Dr. Ved Kumari Ghai. She did her PhD on Nilmat Puran from BHU. And I laid my hands on a translated copy of Nilmat Puran and started reading. I got some fascinating details. It starts with a conversation between King Janmejaya and Rishi Vaishampayan. I don't know whether you've heard of these two names. So have you heard of Arjuna?
Yes.
Arjuna from Mahabharata. So you've heard of his son Abhimanyu.
Yes.
And have you heard of Abhimanyu's son Parikshit?
No.
Okay. So Raja Janmejaya is Parikshit's son.
Okay.
So great grandson of Arjun, grandson of Abhimanyu, son of Parikshit, Raja Janmejaya. So we are talking about the post-Mahabharata period. Okay. And who is Vaishampayan? Vaishampayan is a rishi who was one of the foremost disciples of Ved Vyas. Have you heard of Ved Vyas?
Yes.
Ved Vyas is supposed to have dictated the Mahabharata to Ganesh ji. And Ganesh ji wrote it down. So Ved Vyas is the creator of Mahabharata. Okay. So his foremost disciple, Rishi Vaishampayan. So the two of them are having a conversation, and that is how Nilmat Puran starts. And the question in Nilmat Puran, the first question that Raja Janamejaya asks Rishi Vaishampayan is that in the epic war of Mahabharata, armies from all over, from all directions came across the country called Bharat and beyond. But the armies of Kashmir did not come.
Yes.
What is the reason? It was fascinating to know that even then, in Mahabharat time, Kashmir was called Kashmir. You know, in the very first sentence, there are layers and layers of interesting facts. And this is one of them. And I thought to myself, when Punjab was not called Punjab, when Bengal was not called Bengal, when Maharashtra was not called Maharashtra, when Bihar was not called Bihar and Karnataka was not called Karnataka, Kashmir was still called Kashmir. So over thousands of years, names change, they get distorted or they are deliberately changed.
Yeah.
But Kashmir saw no distortion, no change. It continues unabated. And there are very few such examples of a province, of an entire state called Kashmir. There are some cities like Kashi, whose name continues, or Ujjaini, or Kannauj, or Vaishali. But these are cities. I'm talking about an entire region, an entire state. So again, very fascinated. And also that during Mahabharata, Kashmir was remembered as part of India and its armies were expected. So people who still cast doubt over why Kashmir belongs to India should read this text.
Definitely, definitely. Even we'll suggest our viewers to definitely read Nilmat Purana, and I myself will read Nilmat.
Yes.
Definitely, this
So,
was
so the answer that Rishi Vaishampayan gave was very fascinating, and I'll keep that answer to myself because I'll be taking a lot of time otherwise, and I'll delve deeper into Nilmat Puran, which is not the subject today. And we will have some other session on these issues.
but it is fascinating to know about the history of
Yeah.
Kashmir any day.
Yes. So maybe some other time, and then
Definitely.
after consulting Nilmat Puran, I also browsed through another book called Raj Tarangini. I wonder if you heard of Raj Tarangini.
Yes, yes.
So Raj Tarangini was written about 900 years back by Kalhan, and arguably this is the oldest book of history written anywhere in the world. The modern day historians are unanimous in their view that if we can qualify any ancient texts as a book of history according to our modern standards of critical examination, Raj Tarangini qualifies to be a book of history, and this is the earliest and the oldest, and this is History of Kashmir, written by a Kashmiri called Kalhan. So I'll leave it at that. The fact remains that we are an ancient tradition, an ancient civilization. And you and I, and a whole host of audiences right here, are inheritors and successors of that tradition. We are proud that our ancestors created and nourished this tradition, and it flourished in that land called Kashmir. So that is our connection with Kashmir. That is who we are. The ancient most inhabitants and builder of a civilization called Kashmir. Now, over the period of such long years, how did we distinguish ourselves? How are we different? What is special about these ancestors and this civilization? So Kashmir is, in the larger context of Indian civilization and Indian culture, is called the origin of knowledge traditions. Indian civilization itself is distinguished by the fact that it was known as the knowledge civilization. There are several other civilizations in the world. Some are known for their military prowess. Some were known for their commerce. Some were known for their great expertise in creating buildings and structures. Some are known for something else. But our tradition was known for knowledge, creation of knowledge, and knowledge in every field. You start from language. Sanskrit's grammar was written by the great Panini. This grammar was called Ashtadhyayi. This originated in our region, Swat Valley. You see, knowledge can only be stored and communicated through a language. Unless you have a language, you can do nothing. So to start with, at the very beginning, the language was created by us, our ancestors. So mother of all languages, the oldest, the ancient most, and the most scientific language, Sanskrit, was given to this world by my ancestors. What a fascinating fact to know. And then through that language, what are the various other knowledge traditions that emerged? You've heard of Patanjali?
Yes.
No, I don't mean the brand that Baba Ramdev sells.
No, definitely not that one. I know you're talking about medicine.
So Rishi Patanjali gave us Yoga Sutras. Yoga is one word that the world today knows India by. You go anywhere in the world and you say you are from India, if one word that flashes in their head is yoga, because that is what we've given the world. Especially since UN designated World Yoga Day on 21st of June, and India came to be recognized as the origin, the land of yoga and yogis. That was done in Kashmir. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra were written in Kashmir.
I mean, we can go on and on about the history of Kashmir clearly.
Yes,
vast.
there is, and so suffice it to say, I'll maybe some other time, whether it is literature, whether it is poetics, whether it is art,
Theatre,
whether it is
art.
aesthetics, whether it is science, whether it is philosophy, whether it is religion, origins are in Kashmir. And not just the Hindu, Vedic, Shaiv religion, but even Buddhism. You've heard of Mahayana Buddhism,
Yes, sir.
which was born about 300 years, 350 years after Buddha, was born in Kashmir. And Kashmiris, like Kumarjiva, like Padmasambhava, like Ashwaghosh, like Nagarjuna, gave it to the world and took it from Kashmir to Tibet, to Central Asia, to China, to Korea, to Japan.
Yes.
So that is our contribution to the civilizations of the world, to the world's knowledge traditions, timekeeping, health, maths, architecture, music, dance, sculptures, grammar, philosophy, you name it, it was there. And that is why people from all over the world would come there to learn and to teach, because this was the hub of knowledge creation. Sharada Peeth became extremely popular, and because of this tradition, Kashmir was also called Sharada Pradesh. There is a shlok written by Adi Shankaracharya, Namaste Ma Sharade Kashmira Puravasini, Prarthaye Twamaham Nityam Vidya Jnanam Cha Dehima. That Adi Shankaracharya was born in Kerala, in Kaladi. He walked all the way up to Kashmir. Till he reached Kashmir, he was called Shankaracharya. But when he spent time there and he proved his intellect to his peers, he ascended the seat from the southern gates of Sharada Peeth, and he was declared Jagat Guru. So even acknowledgement of intellect, the right test of intellect, was in Kashmir. Until if you got the acknowledgement in Kashmir, you became world standard philosopher or intellectual. And he was called Jagat Guru in Kashmir at Sharda. So that is who we are. That is where we come from.
Yes.
Now let's come to the topic of the day.
Yeah, that
You
is
want to
what I
talk
was
about?
going to say. Yeah, so the topic of today's webinar is abrogation then, now, and next. So the first question that I have for you is a very standard question, and it is something that the world would really like to understand. How did Article 370 help in the rise of jihad in Kashmir? What was the role of Article 370?
Okay, so what did Article 370 provide for? Article 370 was put in the Constitution of India in the month of November 1949. When Indian Constituent Assembly was busy framing the Constitution of India, and they finished the process on 26th of November 1949. So those who say that Article 370 was a precondition on which Kashmir acceded to India are telling you a lie. Because there was no Article 370 when accession happened. Accession happened on 26th of October 1947. And if accession happened in 1947, and 370 was conceived and debated and accepted in the Constitution more than 2 months later, actually 2 years and 2 months later. So 26 months later. It means 25 months later. It means there's no connection between Article 370 and Jammu Kashmir's accession to Union of India. Now, what did it say? It said that our highest sovereign body, which is Parliament, which is authorized to take decisions on our behalf on every square inch of territory called India, will not be able to take decisions about Jammu and Kashmir. It is its jurisdiction, our Parliament's jurisdiction in the state of Jammu and Kashmir was severely restricted to barely 2 or 3 issues. issues like defense, issues like communication, and issues like external affairs. Nothing else. And even those issues were severely restricted through subsequent orders under 370. Then another thing that Article 370 did was that it did not allow Indian constitution to prevail in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. They said that we will have our own constitution. So in this country, there were two constitutions. One was that was prevalent in India, and another was the one made specifically for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So this is what Article 370 did. And when they created their own constitution, what did they do? They omitted fundamental rights completely. There are no fundamental rights there were no fundamental rights in the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir, which now stands abrogated. There are no minority rights. There were no minority rights for the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir. And there were blatant discriminations. All this was done to give autonomy to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. All these exceptions were created, all these concessions were made in the name of autonomy to Jammu and Kashmir. But why to only Jammu and Kashmir? Why not to rest of India and other states also? This was a legitimate question. Why are you doing this for Jammu and Kashmir? So we are told because Jammu and Kashmir is a Muslim majority state, we need to do this. Then the question that begs an answer is, if India is a secular country, then why should Muslim majority character of any state be a reason for any concession or any exception? Of course, when Jammu and Kashmir joined India, it joined India knowing fully well that India is a secular democracy. India lives under a constitution which is a secular, democratic, republican constitution. It isn't that they didn't know. And there were 4 members from Jammu and Kashmir which were part of the Constituent Assembly that drafted that constitution. So they contributed in the drafting of that constitution. They put their signatures on that constitution. And then they withhold that constitution from Kashmir. They did not apply it, saying we will have our own constitution. This was strange. How could you do this? Why did you do this? Only because that state has Muslim majority character. So this went against the secular principle of Indian Republic, democratic Indian secular republic. But this was allowed to be done. And this perversion created a lot of problems for the minorities in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Because Indian constitution did not apply and fundamental rights did not apply, minority protections were not available. So any action, any atrocity committed by the state, by the majority Muslim state, could not be challenged in any court of India under any provision of Indian constitution. So we did not even have access to appealing against injustice, appealing against discrimination, appealing against atrocities committed through discriminatory policies, committed through blatant exploitation of majoritarian whim. And that is what started the trouble in Kashmir. So when Indian system, Indian democracy, Indian government, Indian leadership was making these exceptions and allowing these distortions in the state of Jammu and Kashmir in the name of Muslim majority, what were you doing? You were legitimizing politics based on religion and religious domination. So the message goes out to Kashmiri Muslims that you are special and different from rest of India, which is why we are giving you these concessions and these privileges. So when you tell people that, listen, because you are Muslims, you will not be subjected to Indian constitution, you will be given special privileges, you will be given special rights, that you will not be governed under the Indian constitution also. Supreme Court will not have jurisdiction over Jammu and Kashmir. Even Election Commission will not have jurisdiction over Jammu and Kashmir. Comptroller and Auditor General will not have jurisdiction over Jammu and Kashmir. You are telling them that you are special because you are Muslims, and therefore you can do as you like. And once this notion strikes root in the mentality, then you start asking for more. If I am Muslim and if I am special, then why just these privileges? Give me more. And along with that was this threat that, listen, India was partitioned because Muslim majority areas went to Pakistan. I'm a Muslim majority area. Give me this or else. Give me that or else. This kind of blackmail started. And it was legitimized in the very beginning when you said, okay, we'll give you 370, which will give you such immunities. So what started in Jammu Kashmir was Muslim identity politics. It soon became grievance mongering politics. And then it deteriorated into separatist politics. That we are separate, we are different. That separatist politics became secessionist politics. Because we are different, we are separate, we will break away. And then that secessionist politics, breakaway politics, led to pro-Pakistan politics, that we not only want to break away, we want to merge with Pakistan. That is our true destination. Because Pakistan was created for the Muslims of subcontinent. We are Muslim majority, so therefore we must join Pakistan. Never mind that India is a secular country. And this pro-Pakistan politics later degenerated into jihad for caliphate. Caliphate doesn't believe in national boundaries. Caliphate doesn't believe in democracy. Caliphate doesn't believe in constitution. Caliphate doesn't believe in secularism. Caliphate doesn't believe in socialism. Caliphate doesn't believe in capitalism. Caliphate believes in Quran and Sharia. And Caliphate believes in no nation, no flag except Islam and Sharia. So that politics, which is why you started seeing ISIS flags, which is why you started hearing such slogans, Yahan kya chalega nizam Mustafa. Azadi ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. Pakistan se rishta kya? La ilaha illallah. So these are the slogans that emerged from the movement which started in the name of Azadi and Muslim majoritarianism. Systematically, they used their autonomy to create an education system which poisoned the minds of generations after generations. that they are different, they are not Indian. India is a Muslim, Hindu majority country, and we are Muslims, we believe in Islam. Muslims cannot live under Hindu rule, so therefore we must go separate. We don't believe in democracy, we believe in Sharia, we believe in Quran, we believe in Nizam Mustafa, we believe in an Islamic order. And that is what led to expulsion, brutal, violent expulsion of Kashmiri Hindus who were less than 5% of the population of the state. This huge steamroller majority of Muslims in Kashmir did not tolerate just a few Hindus amongst them. And through targeted killing, mass murder, rape, they threw us out 30 years back. Does that answer your question, Triveni? Long answer to a short question.
Yes. Since we've read that this wasn't the first genocide of Kashmiri Hindus, prior to 1990, there were 6 other genocides that also occurred. But for the first time, there is a government that has accepted that a genocide occurred, a Kashmiri Hindu genocide did occur in 1999. And what do you think are the steps that the current government should take for the rehabilitation of Kashmiri Hindus in Kashmir?
Triveni, let me correct you.
Yes, sir.
Genocide has not been accepted by this government.
All right.
It just mentioned, by the way, last year, while banning an organization called JKLF and arresting its leader, Yasin Malik,
Yes.
it said that this organization and this leader was responsible for the genocide of Kashmiri Hindus. That is the only place and the only time in the last 30 years
Yes.
they use this word for us. Otherwise, they call us migrants.
Migrants.
Migrants are those who travel from the place of their origin at their own will.
Yes, sir.
And if somebody is very generous, they call us displaced. As if we were displaced by a flood or an earthquake. There is very little acknowledgement, almost absent from the public discourse, that we are neither migrant nor displaced. We are victims and survivors of a brutal genocide.
Yes.
This unequivocal assertion and acknowledgement is missing. Is missing from our own government, who keeps calling us migrants.
Yes, definitely, without a doubt. That.
And therefore, it is a big challenge as to how we get our own government to acknowledge this fact. Whenever I raise this issue, and I've been doing this for several years now, it is the representatives of this government, our government, central government, who tell me, please don't talk about it. Please don't raise these issues. And when I ask them why, am I not telling the truth? Isn't this a fact? Didn't this happen? They say, well, it may have happened, but when you talk about it, it demonizes, I'm using their word, demonizes the Muslims of Kashmir. And they become angry that why are we being accused of this crime? And because of that anger, they feel alienated. It becomes very difficult to win their hearts and minds when you tell the stories of your brutalization. It angers the Muslims of Kashmir, and it comes in the way of our effort to win their hearts and minds. So please don't talk about it. This is how genocide, which is the most heinous crime ever, you can kill a person, you can kill a bunch of people in mass murder. But when you kill an entire community for its identity, for its faith, by driving them out, when you erase their traces from the land of their origin, when you completely cleanse them by killing them in thousands, raping them, looting their homes, burning and desecrating their temples, and committing massacres. United Nations defines this as an act of genocide. And in fact, United Nations came out with a genocide convention in 1948 because we had just emerged from the genocide of Jews. During the Second World War, Hitler and his allies committed a terrible genocide in Europe of the Jews. So United Nations said genocide must have no place in the modern civilized world. And all countries who are members of United Nations should uphold this convention. So India became signatory to this convention in 1959, 11 years later. Now, by becoming a signatory to this convention, it brought certain obligations on India, Indian Parliament. And one such obligation was that in our criminal justice system, in our laws, genocide as a crime should be identified and acknowledged as a specific, a different crime, and a different set of procedures and punishments should be defined, should be provided for in our criminal justice system, in our criminal procedure code. It has been 61 years since Indian Constitution, Indian Penal Code, Indian Criminal Procedure Code do not have any provisions for prosecuting the crime of genocide. So the murders of Kashmiri Hindus that happened in Kashmir are treated as common murders and unrelated murders. That if Neelkant Ganju was killed on 4th of November, it was not related to Tikalal Taplu killed on 14th of September, and it was not related to Premnath Bhatt killed on 28th of December. These were considered standalone murders. Whereas there was a pattern. The most prominent icons of Kashmiri Pandit society in Jammu Kashmir were being specifically targeted to send a message that even your best and the most prominent and most admired, inspiring figures are not safe. What are you doing here? Justice Neelkant Ganju was a retired High Court judge. Mr. Tikalal Taplu was the most popular political leader of Kashmiri Hindus. Mr. Premnath Bhatt was one of the best advocates of Kashmir. If they could be killed in broad daylight with impunity, then who was safe? And all this happened in 1989. Under the rule of Farooq Abdullah, who was running a coalition government with Congress. So Congress and National Conference government was running in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And this government was supported by the central government, which was run by Rajiv Gandhi, again a Congress government. On 4th of November, when Neelkant Ganju was killed, the Prime Minister was Rajiv Gandhi and the Chief Minister was Farooq Abdullah. On 14th of September, when Tikalal Taplu was killed, the Prime Minister was Rajiv Gandhi and the Chief Minister was Farooq Abdullah. In the month of December, Rajiv Gandhi lost elections and VP Singh became the Prime Minister. And he chose Mufti Muhammad Saeed as his Home Minister. So now Kashmir's Chief Minister was Farooq Abdullah and India's Home Minister in charge of India's security, law and order was Mufti Muhammad Saeed, both Kashmiri Muslims. And it was under their watch when things became unbearable. The daily newspapers in Kashmir started publishing notices for us Hindu kafirs that leave Kashmir or else. We had to vacate Kashmir. On 19th of January, we treat as a symbolic day of exodus because on that day, thousands of Kashmiri Pandits fled Kashmir. This is what happened, Triveni.
So, for the first step, the government has to accept that a genocide occurred. Without that, the rehabilitation of Kashmiri Pandits will never happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you whitewash it, if you deny it, it is worse than genocide. Because you are not only condoning a genocide, you are incentivizing it for future genocides. And the second step, which flows from the first step, acknowledging the genocide, is to punish the genociders. Those who caused this crime, those who committed this heinous crime, must be brought to justice. Because till date, Triveni, not even one murder, one rape, one massacre, not even one looting of house or desecrating of temple has been prosecuted under law, guilt fixed, and the guilty sentenced or punished. Not even one crime. It's 30 years. There are thousands of crimes and thousands of FIRs awaiting justice. So the second step is delivering justice. Actually, it is not just that justice has not been delivered, but those criminals who should have been punished have actually become leaders, have become icons. They have been gloating about these murders and massacres as some kind of a trophy. And government of India, instead of prosecuting them, punishing them, have treated them like sons-in-law. They spent crores on them. On their air tickets, on their hotel bills, on their fuel, on their cars, on their security, even on their treatment abroad. Indian taxpayers' money, hundreds of crores are spent every year on leaders of Hurriyat who were directly responsible for our genocide and for the jihad that India faces in the state of Jammu and Kashmir.
In one of your interviews, you said scrapping of Article 370 shows intent. Real battle lies ahead. Could you please explain this for our viewers? What is the real battle that lies ahead?
Okay. So I mentioned to you what Article 370 did.
Yes.
And under this, what happened was Jihad found an opportunity to take a stranglehold of Jammu and Kashmir.
Yes.
And this stranglehold is so deep and so vast that even the media, the academia, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the civil society, the chambers of commerce, the political parties, everything is under its spell, is under its control. People who sympathize with jihad and support jihad and actively participate in jihad are in control of the society there. This is the result of Article 370 and 35A. Now, what you did last year on August 5 was an announcement in the parliament and some papers signed by the President of India. That's what happened.
Yes.
So this was at best breaking a institutional or legal framework on paper, formally. It's like passing the law that dowry is illegal. But unless you now start prosecuting those who commit this crime, it will not translate on ground. You can make a law that burning the tricolor is illegal and a punishable offense. But if you do not arrest people who burn the national flag or who disrespect the national anthem and do not punish them, what good is that law? Likewise, on August 5, 2019, you dismantled Article 370 and 35A.
Yes.
But in implementation of the spirit of that dismantling, if you do not weed out the jihadi stranglehold from Jammu Kashmir, what good is this decision? It is at best a declaration of intent. It has to be followed through.
Yes.
Now, I'm not trying to belittle the significance of this decision because it took 70 years. Governments after governments were reluctant. They did not have the political courage or the will to take tough decisions. And this tough decision was taken. But it meant that now what will follow will be transformational. Branch and root transformation of Kashmir must. That has not happened. The real battle, which has to be fought on ground, by weeding out those people who, under the patronage of this article, gained strength, gained authority, gained control of all aspects of living, everyday living in Kashmir, are still in control. When will you break their back? And when will you seize these levers of power from their control? That is where the real battle is.
Lastly, what would you like to address our viewers who, or what would you like to tell them who are not Kashmiris but nevertheless have an equal stake in Kashmir, especially after the abrogation of Article 370?
You see, first and foremost, Kashmir has been defended by entire country. There is not a single district in this country, we have more than 900 districts, where they have not contributed their sons and brothers to defense of India and Kashmir, where they have not shed lives and blood in defending Kashmir against the jihad. So Kashmir is not just yours and mine, Triveni. Kashmir belongs to the entire country. And Kashmir is as much theirs as it is mine and yours. So they have every right and every claim on that land. This is point number one. Point number two is that what we face in Kashmir for the last several decades is already happening in more than 500 places across the country, where even at the lack of Article 370, because we are a liberal, freedom-loving, tolerant democracy and secular to a fault, we have allowed such elements to become powerful in these clusters, and they have started driving out Hindus from these clusters. So Kashmir-like situation, if it is not corrected in Kashmir itself, will begin to spread like a pandemic across the country. It already has. So Battle of Kashmir is battle of every patriotic Indian. And they must own up this battle and fight it as hard as they can. And three, just electing a good government on the promise that they will do all the good work and set things right is not enough. You cannot afford to go back to sleep after voting in a nice government and a nice leader. Because such governments and such leaders, out of ignorance or out of reluctance to take tough decisions, especially on ground, keep procrastinating and postponing the solutions, and instead are tempted to manage the problems. India has been trying to manage the problem called Kashmir, not to solve it, which is why it remains unsolved. This approach is betrayal of the mandate, because mandate was for a root and branch change of policy. If you continue the policy of managing the problem, you are betraying a mandate. So vigilant electorate, vigilant citizenship, vigilant patriotism is the need of the hour, and that must seek answers from the leaders we elect. We must keep asking for the accountability. After the abrogation, or let's say the neutering of Article 370 last year, several such steps have been taken which do not amount to progression from where we started on August 5, but regression. Looks like one step forward, two steps back. That should not be permitted, because what we face in Kashmir is a grim battle for survival. And if we fail in Kashmir, our failure in rest of India is guaranteed. We are doomed. We cannot afford to fail in Kashmir. And hence, entire country needs to be vigilant. Own Kashmir as the problem they themselves face, not just we as Kashmiri Hindus faced. Thank you, Triveni, for asking that question.
Thank you so much, sir. This webinar with you has been extremely knowledgeable. We've actually touched every topic possible. We've spoken about the history of Kashmir. We've spoken about the rise of jihad. We've spoken about how it is a civilizational battle. And you've also mentioned what are the next steps that the government can take and what should be the roadmap to not to manage Kashmir, but to actually eradicate the problem altogether. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of our webinar on our first anniversary. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.
Congratulations on your first anniversary. More strength to you. And I'm happy that your quest for information and understanding got us together. And I look forward to more interaction with you in future. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.